For generations in Detroit and across our nation, the brothers and sisters of labor have stood together to righteously demand fair pay, better benefits, and safe working conditions. And let me say, every person in our nation has benefited from that work. Everywhere I go, I tell people, look, you may not be a union member. You better thank a union member for the 5-day work week. You better thank a union member for sick leave. You better thank a union member for paid leave. You better thank a union member for vacation time. Because what we know is when union wages go up, everybody's wages go up. When union workplaces are safer, every workplace is safer. When unions are strong, America is strong.
Our opening clip was Vice President Kamala Harris speaking at a campaign stop in Detroit, Michigan. Find out why in this week's episode, Harris and Biden are pro-union compared to other recent Democratic administrations and why that matters greatly for our economy and our democracy. I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones, about Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine, a history repeating today under Putin. There are just 62 days until Election Day on November 5th, 2024, a pivotal moment that will decide if democracy or dictatorship leads the White House and Congress. Feeling overwhelmed by the election? We've got you covered. Join our new weekly political salon on Mondays at 4 p.m. Eastern via Zoom. This is your space to vent, ask questions, seek support, and help shape our discussions here on the broader show. Everyone's welcome, and no, this isn't about replacing patriarchy with a matriarchy. We're aiming for coalition and collective healing to build a sustainable future for all. Starting next Monday, our salons will be recorded and shared on Patreon to support others in our community facing similar challenges. If you find these sessions valuable, we might keep them going post-election. To join, support us at the Truther level on Patreon at patreon.com/gaslit. We'll post the Zoom link there every Monday afternoon. See you at 4 p.m. Eastern, starting this Monday. Today's guest has been fighting for our democracy for decades and was called by Time magazine as an architect of a broad coalition that worked tirelessly to protect the integrity of the 2020 election. Michael Podhorzer is the former longtime political director of the AFL-CIO, the largest federation of unions in the United States. Podhorzer is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, the chair of the Analyst Institute, the Research Collaborative, and the Defend Democracy Project. And he writes the Substack Weekend Reading. We'll link to his latest piece in the show notes. Let's get to it. So obviously, we're living in times of historic income inequality. How did we get here?
Sure. The way we got here was by forgetting everything we learned the last time we had the same amount of inequality before the New Deal, right? At that point, there were the robber barons, the Gilded Age. What laissez-faire capitalism was even more running amok than it is today. If you can believe that, Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of Treasury, and that didn't seem odd. Like, it was like just assumed that the purpose of government was to protect the already rich from the rest of us, right? That was still an era where people who went on strike could be shot. The United States, before the New Deal, had the most state violence against it, the union movement, of any of the Western industrialized nations. And it took longest to get to the point where the kind of union we now take for granted was actually legalized, which really didn't happen until the early 30s after Roosevelt came in. And in so many ways, in that moment, there was an actual sense of class conflict, that we weren't living in a world where what was good for business was good for everybody else, or that was the way we just had to take it for granted. And as a result, we kicked off a period in which working people had much more agency than they have since, and where what is true in any capitalist system is that it will run amok, it will crash everything, it will make this kind of inequality if there isn't a countervailing power. And that was explicitly the purpose of the Wagner Act and the early New Deal legislation, was to give working people the power to contest GM or US Steel or the big companies at the time. And it worked, right? It worked. It created a shared prosperity, especially coming out of World War II, that really was unrivaled before or since in terms of a large nation experiencing that much growth and sharing it as equally. Of course, at the beginning, there's a really important exception in America, which is that it was not well distributed racially. It was still coming out of Jim Crow, and of course, in terms of gender. But that prosperity and the fact that it wasn't just like raining from heaven, but the product of a very, movement that had 30% of the working force in it, meant that it created the conditions for the legislation we saw in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and equal pay, and all of those things, right? That had the power. And then by the mid 70s, the combination of many factors gave the business community, which had never really wanted to accept this new order, just enough opening to begin to unravel all of this. And I'm sure, like I've heard on your show and other places, it's sort of called the neoliberal revolution or counter-revolution. But really, in addition to the things that usually get mentioned about that, which are all important, probably one of the most important is really the dismantling of worker power. That unless working people can aggregate themselves and act collectively in an institutional way, voting is a thin protection against what the capitalists can do. And it coincided with a kind of decision by the business community that because of divisions within the two-party system, there were many things on their wish list that Republican presidents couldn't get done. And so in that period, they began to support Democrats, so that by 1976 and pretty much on until the Biden administration, you had a Democratic Party that wasn't out to destroy unions explicitly in the way the Republican Party was, but was all too ready to embrace policies like NAFTA or all the pro-business or banking deregulation or all the deregulations of the Clinton era and Obama era, all things that if Republican presidents had proposed, Democratic Congresses would have rejected. And so the combination, like in that period from 76 really till pretty recently, was predicated on this sort of market rationalism that whose real aim was to destroy union power. And that's pretty much how we got here. That's sort of to me, both frustrating and exhausting thing is you hear people today, oh, if we only had a solution for income inequality, or, oh, if we only had, ways for everybody to have pensions or good health care, or people to have more power in the democracy, the people saying it don't realize that we had that and threw most of it away. And it's still working where it exists, right? And so that's the path forward, is just remembering that you can't have a democracy without unions.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important that you point out that the Democrats got paid off too by this intentional corporate strategy. We have the Powell memo, which came out, the Powell memo where you could probably talk more about that, but where a letter was sent out rallying all the business leaders of, I believe it was in the 1970s, to set up
1971, yeah.
1971 to set up shop in Washington, D.C. to lobby the government to basically attack the New Deal and roll back regulations, reduce taxes, and just declare all-out war on workers. And then part of that strategy eventually led to buying off the Democratic Party establishment as well. And Biden, surprisingly, has been pro-union, given his upbringing. It runs in his family. So even though he's been in the establishment for so long, what would you say about was there he's always been the Democratic Party establishment, but then as president, where did his change come from, would you say? Why has he been so surprising and refreshing and joining a union march?
Right.
What do you think that came from?
So one thing I want to suggest, which is a sort of different story of what happened to the Democratic Party, that hopefully will ring more true and make sort of clear what was going on and what has been going on, which is that there wasn't like a Democratic Party to be bought off. People who said, I used to think unions were important, but now that I got this pile of cash, I'm going to change sides. What happened instead was that business poured huge amount of resources in replacing the Democrats who were on our side with Democrats who, in their truest sense, agreed with business on these things. It wasn't like a quid pro quo process. It was support. It was throwing huge amounts of support to Democrats who had no ties to the labor movement to be successful. And we saw how comfortable those Democratic presidents were bringing along people from Wall Street and Larry Summers and all of those.
Under Obama. Mm-hmm. Larry Summers under Obama.
And it wasn't like they were bending their consciences. They believed it. And that was why business was willing to stake them in their efforts to become the Democratic establishment. And a big difference, to your question about Biden, a big difference between Carter, Clinton, and Obama and Biden and Harris on the other side is that the first three all rose to their perch to run for president without ever having to work with unions to get their support, right? In Arkansas and Georgia are right-to-work states. So you become governor of those states, and your political education doesn't expose you to working people in that way. You find a way to succeed by appealing to the business community. And, Obama, even though Illinois is a union state, remember, went from state legislator to senator because he was running against Alan Keyes to president.
Very quick.
Right. And without having to go to a lot of union hall first, right, to get there, without actually getting into his DNA what life for working people really is. Delaware, Pennsylvania, California are places where there's still substantial union power. And so, in order to be a successful politician in those states, you do have to take the time to go to union halls, to picnics, to meeting with constituents or have it who are just plain working people in a way those three other presidents didn't as they were rising. And so I think Biden especially understands personally a lot more of this stuff. And that was reflected in a lot of what he did.
There's reports that Kamala Harris is being pressured by mega donors to roll back the Biden-Harris administration plan to tax the rich, which we desperately need now, especially with climate crisis. And we need we need to build climate sustainability and so much more. So we need the rich to pay their share in taxes. So do you think she's going to be pressured by that just to get elected? Do you think her administration will succumb to that pressure? What's your forecast on that? And what would you advise her?
Well, I think that a few things. They wouldn't be billionaires if they didn't want to not pay taxes, right? Right? I mean, that's how you become a billionaire, partly. And so there's nothing, especially after Citizens United, like that is a curse that our democracy has to suffer, right? That the voice of those mega donors becomes more important, right? And is not going away tomorrow. So will she be discouraged from raising taxes on them? Of course, right? That's politics. Will she succumb to it is the more important question. And at a different level, and I don't want to sound pessimistic here, but realistic, are there even yet the votes in Congress to do it? And so it's because even if those donors you're referring to can't convince her, they'll just go to work on the 200 whatever Democratic representatives and the 50 Democratic senators. Right? And then go to the Supreme Court. So if you, as I do, want to see tax rates go much higher the way they were when America was working for working people, we have to take in a task that's broader than making sure that just Harris doesn't succumb.
What could she do to combat the crisis of income inequality in America by executive order? Is there anything she could do if she gets 4 years? Just executive order, not having to deal with Congress.
I think that one of the things that Biden did that was almost invisibly important in this area was walking the picket line with the UAW. Because beyond that strike, it sent a signal to all business that the United States government was going to side with working people and start enforcing the labor laws we have. And so that's not even an executive order. That's just doing your job seriously. And I'm reasonably confident that will continue, although it remains to be seen. But sustaining an environment where working people feel safe, trying to form unions or to ask for more from their employers is actually a pretty big deal, as we've seen over the last couple of years. And then in terms of executive orders and such, the list of things that Biden has put into the regulatory process, for notice of inquiry, rulemaking and all those things will hopefully also continue. And the appointment she makes to the NLRB and other relevant boards will be pro-worker, and all those things will be important. Will it be enough for a New Deal scale revival? No, because that also required a much greater it wasn't like Roosevelt came in saying, I'm going to bless working people now with these powers. It's because working people were literally risking their lives. They were, sit down strikes. They were doing the things that demanded that response, right? And until all of us, even if we have good jobs or aren't in unions, until we just understand that our democracy and freedoms depend on there being strong unions, we won't get the really ambitious reforms that are necessary to recreate that world.
How did the Reagan Revolution contribute to the income inequality crisis that we're in now?
It accelerated it, right? It was the opening salvo of reducing taxes on the rich and sort of purveying this idea of trickle down. And yeah, I now get to be like old person, but I came to DC and started doing this work in 1976. And I can attest that until he was elected, people just laughed at that idea. I mean, literally laughed. Oh my God, you're going to like lower taxes on the rich and we're all going to be better off. Because it's obviously laughable, except people believe it's in their interest to believe. And it suddenly became irrefutable. And that kind of twist from people generally sort of taking as the conventional wisdom that America should be a pluralistic country to one in which we just needed to make sure there was a good business environment and was immense. And it was like snowballing downhill from there.
How did this recent renaissance of labor unions come to be?
Well, as I said, part of it is that the fact that the Biden administration was so aggressive in signaling that a change in direction was going on. But the other thing, and I'm actually publishing in an hour or so, a piece about this. As you know, name an institution in America, and since 2009, people's confidence in that institution, whether it's the presidency or the Supreme Court or the police or the military or big business, has gone down to really low levels, right? The only exception has been labor unions, which even though you don't hear about them in the mainstream media anymore, their actions, their successes have actually increased how much people approve of them and how much they think America would be better off if unions had more power. I'm not making this up. This is Gallup, right? And not only does it contradict the general trend of people being less and less supportive of the basic institutions in this country, that increase since 2009 happened among Republican voters as well. It's literally like the only thing that has partisan inflection. Most people know unions are kind of democratic, capital D. And yet approval of unions and belief that unions should be more powerful actually went up in that period, right? And I think it's because, and I picked 2009 for obvious reasons, because that's the crash. And after the crash, all of the institutions that working people should have been looking to for assistance in that crisis let them down utterly. The one institution that didn't was the one that they had agency in, unions. Because unions are the working people who are there, pay the dues, democratically elect the leaders, and are completely unburdened by having to believe in trickle-down economics and understand that this is all about either the boss gets rich or we get what we deserve. And when other people who feel utter helplessness in this work environment see other work people succeeding at that, then that is where the Renaissance is coming from.
In what ways does our government subsidize the rich?
Sorry. I mean, until really the New Deal in the United States, the baseline assumption about what the purpose of government was to protect the rich and powerful, right? From us, right? From the pitchforks, basically, right? The sort of notion that we actually control the government and the right thing for it to do is to make sure we all had prosperous lives. You'd sort of be seen as, alien from outer space for talking that way, because that just wasn't what the government did, right? And by that point, in most of the rest of the industrializing world, labor unions had succeeded in creating labor parties, and which created a kind of variation on that, where you understood if the conservatives won the election, then government would work on behalf of business. If labor won the election, it would work on behalf of labor. Right. And here in the New Deal era, that kind of happened for a little while. But it created this myth that really hasn't been that true since, which is that, like, the purpose of government is first and foremost to protect us and to level the playing field. And so it's hard to say how they're subsidized in enormous ways, right? There's still fossil fuel subsidies. But in some ways, I think the way in which a broader way to think of how government subsidizes business is how it's rewritten laws to protect business. Think of the way in which it's almost impossible to bring a class action suit now. That is a business subsidy. Look at the way it's even harder to get jury trials when you go up against corporations. That's a subsidy for business. Deciding that gig workers should be treated as independent contractors so they can't have a union. That's a subsidy to Uber and Lyft and all of the gig companies. And in terms of people's everyday lives, some of those actions are much more consequential than the dollar subsidies. That it is giving business free rein. That's the biggest subsidy.
So how can we continue this union renaissance and fight back and have hopefully a president who is pro-union, like Kamala Harris, hopefully, when we're up against Trump's judges rolling back and blocking our progress?
And it's not surprising in terms of the judges, because up until the very first things that the New Deal tried to do, like really basic things like minimum wage and other things, the Supreme Court at the time kept striking down. It is, again, in almost its entire history, the Supreme Court has really been there to be the last line of defense against democracy. That it's like if there's too much democracy breaking out in Congress, that like they can clean it up afterwards. It's kind of similar to the quote democracy, although it's like uncomfortable to see it this way, in Iran, right? Where they have like a democratic legislature, but they have a guardian council to make sure that whatever that Congress passes doesn't violate those principles. And it's kind of the same thing here, that for a long time, we knocked ourselves out passing environmental regulations, and then we get Chevron. And if you think about what the Roberts Court, which is really there as a project of the coalition of revanchist capitalists and theocrats, they've accomplished what the final agenda items that could never happen through a small d democratic process, right? Can you imagine someone in Congress introducing a bill that says, let's let billionaires spend as much as they want in elections, or let's repeal the Voting Rights Act, or let's not get in the way of politicians gerrymandering, or any of those things, right? There's no way that that could happen in a democratic fashion. And that's what the Supreme Court's there for. And that's why the capture by the sort of Federalist Society project has been so devastating to us. But it's also important to remember that popular reaction overcame that earlier court called the Lochner Court, that there is still enough democracy in this country when we all get together to make it too costly to do those things for business. And that's what we have to do again. Again, it's like if when you heard about the UAW being on strike and you thought, you go UAW, I hope you get what you deserve. Well, good for you. But if you thought, for my life to flourish, for us to have a richer democracy, they have to win. My fate's linked up with those working people. And when we again understand that, that's when action can start again.
So the way we overcome the Supreme Court of today is we unionize, we support our unions. What are some other practical steps that people can take?
Well, I mean, one thing that about the Supreme Court at this point, right, is that we also have to make clear to capital D Democrats that the way they have been rolled for the last 15 years by the Supreme Court is no longer acceptable. And we've kind of given them a pass on it, right? And that's an important part of it too, right? Is that in, the same way in which for decades, the Democratic Party didn't embrace abortion rights in any kind of full-throated way, in the same way that when Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, or any of them were up for confirmation, Democrats didn't walk out, right? They didn't make it clear what putting them on the court would actually mean for people. But our reaction to the Dobbs decision, and they've done a 180. And that's like we have to be in that place.
Do you think pushing Democrats, pushing hopefully a president, Kamala Harris, to expand the court, do you think that should be part of a collective action?
I think that I would be for even more ambitious reform than that. I think in terms of conceptualizing it, like the way you were just sort of talking about expanding the court, which is a really good idea because it's kind of crazy where we are now, right?
And FDR tried it.
Right. But it's also that our thinking about it has to be about unpacking the courts, that we are in this situation because they successfully packed the courts, right? And we have to not just expand the court, but really be ambitious and intentional about how to reduce the power of the interests that have hacked that have hacked the Republican Congress, that are across the board. Because when you think about, if you think about just like Supreme Court reform, again, I'm not against it, but if you think about it from sort of looking at the Supreme Court end of the telescope instead of the Koch end of the telescope.
Go after the dark money funders. Go after the Koch politically tax them.
Right, because that money is fluid, right? You cut them off at this pass, and we have such a constitution that makes it so easy to hack if you have those kinds of resources, that we have to understand the Kochs are the problem, not the number of people on the Supreme Court. And if we're just thinking about solving this through process, rather than rebalancing power, then we may win, quote, win something, but it won't matter as much as we think it will, because they'll just find a different way to do the influence.
Do you think the U.S. is an oligarchy? Why or why not?
Ha! I think, I'm surprised you gave me a why not option, but actually I don't think it's an oligarchy. I think that it is a competitive plutocracy.
Isn't that the same thing?
No, because I think what's underappreciated by many who are justifiably appalled by the power of capitalists in this country, that we may not see the way in which, other than sort of, making our lives miserable, they have very different interests and are really two pretty solid factions that are represented in the Democratic and Republican parties right now. Right? The Republican Party is the party of the fossil fuel and other extractive industries and of wanting a sort of red state, low wage economy. Right? The Democrats are captured by tech and finance and by the companies that need knowledge workers and innovation and international commerce. And beyond sort of when they're just looking at, say, tax cuts, those are real big differences where they both can't get everything they want, right? And so I call it a competitive plutocracy because there isn't just like a single oligarchy here. What's going on is that the two tectonic sort of forces that more or less line up along what was the Mason-Dixon line and is now the Dobbs line have different visions of the capitalist future they want this country to be. And when you think about how large we are, 330 million people, it is, I think, with such diversity from, the oil fields to the tech centers, that it's tractable to a single oligarchy seems like overly ambitious. And so the way in which much of that competition gets worked out is through our voting for one or the other. So that's my rephrasing of your oligarchy or not, right? I mean, we live in a competitive plutocracy in which we have some ability to veto the worst.
What would you say to the parents out there listening, working maybe extra jobs, and they're concerned about their kids' future? Will their kids get a chance at a job, given the rise of AI, given corporate greed, and given this law warfare stranglehold on our democracy with the federal society and the court capture and so on? What would you say to the parents listening about whether their children have a future of being able to thrive in America?
I would say that their kids' best shot at having a future is them engaging now in working to create that country. I've said some things that might sound that could be interpreted or heard as sort of gloom and doom, right?
No,
But
you're just calling it like you see it, like so many out there see it.
right, exactly. And doing that means remembering how far we've come and honoring that. This was a country born by enslaving people and then by Jim Crow. It was a country in which the women had no rights until ridiculously recently. And people believed in that future you're asking about for today's parents' kids. And so it has been done, it can be done. But I don't believe the universe has a moral arc that's bending to justice. I think it's always been just a tug of war between the privileged and the rest of us. going back to sort of the beginning of societies. And so in that metaphor, unless all of us are willing to grab our end of the rope and pull, we'll keep losing. But like if we hold on to it and pull and institutionalize it, right, which is why I keep coming back to why unions are important, then we have a fighting chance.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up at the Truth Teller level and higher on Patreon at patreon.com/gaslit. It's go time. We have a lot of events gearing up for the election. Join our new Monday political salons held over Zoom every Monday through the election at 4 p.m. Eastern. Join the discussion and help shape the show by sharing what's on your mind. Sign up by subscribing at the Truth Teller level or higher on patreon.com/gaslit. On September 10th, join the Gaslit Nation Debate Watch Party in the Victory Chat on Patreon. It's going to be a debate between democracy versus dictatorship, featuring a convicted felon who belongs in prison, not on a debate stage. On September 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern, if you're in New York, join our in-person live taping at the Ukrainian Institute of America in New York City. Celebrate the release of In the Shadow of Stalin, the graphic novel adaptation of my film Mr. Jones, directed by the great Agnieszka Holland. Gaslit Nation Patreon supporters get in free, so message us on Patreon to be added to the guest list. A wine and cheese and whatever else they serve there will be followed. So excited. I will be joined by the journalist Terrell Starr to talk about his latest trip to Ukraine. On September 17 at 12 p.m. Eastern, join our virtual live taping with investigative journalist Stephanie Baker, author of Punishing Putin: Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. Her book has been highly praised by Bill Browder, the advocate behind the Magnitsky Act to combat Russian corruption. On September 18th at 4 p.m. Eastern, join our virtual live taping with the one and only politics girl, Lee McGowan, author of A Return to Common Sense: How to Fix America Before We Really Blow It. On September 24 at 12 p.m. Eastern, join our virtual live taping with David Pepper, author of Saving Democracy. Join us as David discusses his new art project based on Project 2025. That's all about resistance art. All those events, becoming a member of our Victory Chat, bonus shows, all shows ad-free, and more, come with your subscription on patreon.com/gaslit. Gaslit Nation is produced by Andrea Chalupa, that's me. Our production manager is Nicholas Torres, and our associate producer is Carlin Daigle. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon, it keeps us going. Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle. Our logo design was donated to us by my friend Hamish Smythe of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish. Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon and higher. Ice Bear is Defiant, Work for Better, Prep for Trouble, Lily Wachowski, John Schoenthaler, Ellen McGirt, Larry Gasson, D. Scott, Ann Bertino, David East, Joseph Mara Jr., Mark, Sean Berg, Kristen Custer, Kevin Gannon, Sandra Collins, Katie Masuris, James D. Leonard, Leo Chalupa, Carol Golstad, Marcus J. Trent, Joe Darcy, Ann Marshall, D.L. Singfield, Nicole Spear, Abby Rode, Jans Alstrup Rasmussen, Sarah Gray, Diana Gallagher, Leah Campbell, Jared Lombardo, Abby Zavos, and Tanya Chalupa. Thank you to everyone who supports the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.